The Coast Guard stopped the boat of an 81-year-old veteran, and just 45 minutes later, his former student led a naval fleet to honor him. Why did they stop the vessel? What legacy does Iron Wave carry? And what caused the shores of New Jersey to erupt the moment that naval convoy arrived? This is not just the story of a detained boat. It's a journey of engineering, mentorship, and a loyalty that defies time. Join us as we uncover the story of Edward Brooks, a former maritime engineer who reminded an entire community of the value of legacy and innovation. Don't look away. This story will carry you from quiet injustice to a blazing crescendo, where truth burns bright like fire. Subscribe now, so you never miss the stories that move the heart. These are stories from the shores of New Jersey, where waves crash against the coast like the ancient heartbeat of the ocean. One man stands just as steady, Edward Brooks, 81 years old. To the residents of Atlantic City, he is not just a veteran. He is a symbol of persistence, ingenuity, and the kind of engineering brilliance that has weathered every season of sea and storm. For over 4 decades, he's been seen every morning, arriving like clockwork. His navy coat faded by time, its shoulders worn thin as though carrying the weight of history itself. In his hands, blueprint scrolls on translucent drafting paper, the edges frayed, the ink gently smudged by salt air. His silver hair tousled beneath an old naval cap. He isn't tall, but his back is straight, and his stride precise. Like the ticking of a metronome that keeps the rhythm of a harbor no one ever truly wanted to forget. He nods to fishermen mending their nets. He offers a firm, weathered smile to the kids selling bait by the docks. He doesn't speak much, but his presence alone steadies the waterfront, like a mast still standing through the center of a storm. His boat, Iron Wave, is a living testament to time and memory. For 45 years, it's remained anchored, its oak hull thick and resilient, scarred with gashes like battle marks etched deep into a warrior's skin. Its mooring rope is frayed down to the final threads, yet it clings tight, like a symbol of loyalty that never lets go. Inside the wheelhouse hangs a small bronze plaque, inscribed with one word: innovation. To strangers, Iron Wave is just an old vessel, but to Atlantic City, it's a floating classroom, a monument to engineering, a beacon for generations learning about maritime mechanics, perseverance, and the spirit of invention. Edward doesn't keep the boat for fishing or leisure. He preserves it as a vessel of knowledge, teaching young minds how to align wooden planks with the current, how to calculate wave force, how to balance a ship using both intellect and hands. Iron Wave is part of history. During World War II, Edward designed life-saving equipment for naval ships. This boat is its embodiment, where engineering met patriotism in every bolt and beam. That morning, the sky was clear, the sea calm. Edward prepared for another lesson. He checked the sails, polished the bronze plaque glowing in the sunlight. Beside him, 18-year-old Marcus, his newest student, neatly arranged tools, chisels, wooden boards, wave charts. The air carried the reverence of a ritual about to begin. When all was ready, Edward untied the mooring. His fingers brushed against the plaque. He whispered, like a promise, "Today, we create." But just as the engine turned over, a black SUV roared toward the dock. Out stepped a Coast Guard officer, face cold as morning frost. He approached, hand outstretched stiffly. "Papers. Now," he said, voice sharp and dry. Calmly, Edward pulled out a folder: boat registration, operation permit, even certification for educational use. All in order. But the officer's expression didn't shift. "This vessel lacks a modern navigation system," he stated flatly, without waiting for a single explanation. Edward looked him straight in the eye. "This is a training ship," he said, steady. "It saved more lives than you know." But reason couldn't pierce the frozen wall of procedure. A patrol boat approached, wave slamming against iron wave, rocking it violently. 3 officers jumped aboard, saying nothing. Edward was bound, forced down onto the cold deck. The blueprint clutched tightly in his arms. On his knees, pressed to the planks, he held the drawings to his chest and said hoarsely, "This boat is a legacy." No one replied. The patrol boat's engine roared. Iron Wave was hauled away like a prisoner in chains. Edward was placed on a wooden bench beside the dock, watching the boat disappear beyond the horizon. The blueprint trembled in his hands from the wind, but his eyes did not. Marcus stood frozen. Silently, he took out his phone and began recording. One caption. Just one line. "They took Mr. Edward." The video spread fast. People gathered at the dock, but stayed silent. No one intervened, but everyone felt it. A wrong had just occurred. Edward wasn't angry. He quietly opened a notebook, the one filled with the names of every student he'd ever taught. The last page remained blank. He stared at it, as if asking, "Is there anyone left who wants to learn how to preserve what matters?" Mrs. Ellen, owner of the cafe down the street, brought a cup of hot coffee. She placed it gently in his hand. He didn't drink it. Later, a young officer returned with a formal statement. "Your vessel is in violation of maritime safety codes." The town remained silent, but peace had left the air. What lingered now was like hot coal beneath ash. Edward clutched the blueprint tighter, eyes locked toward where Iron Wave had vanished. The sea breeze lifted his worn coat slightly, revealing the faded silver naval insignia over his heart. He said nothing, but everyone felt it. He was waiting for an action, a voice, for justice. And when it comes, the shores of New Jersey won't just witness a return. They will witness a declaration of loyalty, of knowledge, of a teacher who never backed down. Edward Brooks sat motionless on the weathered wooden bench at the Atlantic City harbor, the very place where, for over 4 decades, he had lived as part of the soul of this sea-worn town. In his arms, he held the blueprint of the vessel he built, clutched tightly, as if letting go would scatter a lifetime of knowledge, effort, and memory into the salty wind. His eyes didn't meet the worried glances of passers-by. He didn't acknowledge the anxious stares of neighbors. He looked only out to sea, toward Iron Wave, the boat he called his engineering heart, now being towed away by the Coast Guard. The harbor, once filled with the thumping of fish in nets and children laughing near the bait stalls, had fallen into an eerie silence. Not the calm of nature, but the silence of a ring, waiting for justice to strike. The news didn't need a headline. Like fire catching dry fuse, word of Edward being handcuffed and Iron Wave seized spread from Ellen's coffee shop to church pews, from dinner tables to the radios in captains' cabins. And in that moment, Atlantic City didn't stay quiet. It began to smolder. Iron Wave wasn't just an old boat. To outsiders, it was scratched wood and an outdated engine. But to Atlantic City, it was a lighthouse for kids who loved machines. a floating classroom where Edward taught the ancient craft of shipbuilding, wood joinery, wave pressure physics, and structural stress analysis. "Every plank is a lesson," he once said, voice deep and steady as stone. "This knowledge has saved lives." And now, as Edward sat detained on shore, he looked like a warrior without a flag, his posture upright, his eyes blazing with the search for justice. Online, the video, "They took Mr. Edward," posted by Marcus, spread like wildfire. In hours, tens of thousands of views. Comments rolled in like war drums. "Release Edward now! Iron Wave is a living museum! Who dares seize the symbol of Atlantic City?" Among them stood out a post from a man named James Carter, an engineer now living in Newark. "In 1985, I learned shipbuilding from Mr. Brooks. He didn't just teach technique, he taught integrity. Iron Wave was my first school." That message pierced through social media, from New Jersey to California. This was no longer a personal story. It was the collective voice of a generation whose spark had been lit by Edward Brooks. And more than 200 miles away, at the Norfolk Naval Base, Thomas Reed, now Chief Naval Engineer, had just ended his shift when the video flashed across his screen. He didn't need to watch it twice. His face tightened. His eyes locked on the image of Edward in restraints, blueprint still clutched to his chest. The sight hit him like a blade. In 1987, Thomas was just a poor kid with oil-stained hands, learning beneath the deck of Iron Wave. Edward had told him, "You're an engineering flame. Never let it burn out." Now that flame reignited, burning with fury and duty. Thomas rose, gripping his phone. He called command, his voice sharp as steel. "Prep the fleet. We're going to Atlantic City. The teacher doesn't fight alone." Back at the harbor, Edward knew none of this. He still sat, still stared at the sea. Mrs. Ellen brought a loaf of bread and gently placed it in his hands. "You're a legend," she whispered. He nodded, but didn't eat. He opened an old notebook, the one where he recorded the names of every student he ever taught. Familiar names surfaced: Thomas, James, Linda, Malcolm, each one a memory, each one a vow, to teach until his last breath. A Coast Guard officer returned, voice stiff. "Your boat violated navigation regulations." No apology, no empathy, just bureaucracy. The town's mayor stayed silent. No one wanted to challenge the system, but online, outrage boiled. Edward's former students formed a group, Bring Back Iron Wave. The hashtag #FreeIronWave flooded every platform. Marcus posted again, "Mr. Edward is our legacy. Who will stand for him?" A former sailor chimed in 1990, my ship ran aground. Mr. Brooks fixed it with his bare hands, never asked for a dime. He just said, pass it on. Iron Wave is our forge of skill." In Norfolk, Thomas stared at his screen, his eyes lit like fire. "The fleet's ready," he said, voice solid as iron. Back in Atlantic City, Edward still sat, still silent, but his gaze no longer smoldered. It blazed, like a spark waiting for the wind. The harbor wasn't quiet anymore, not with waves, not with whistles, but with the heartbeat of a town waking up. Atlantic City was waiting, like a silent army, ready to burn for justice. That morning, a ship's horn roared through the mist, an echo not from the present, but from the past. A sound that seemed to carry the memory of the Pacific, where Edward Brooks once served. Fitting gear teeth by hand, patching hulls mid-battle. Now at 81, he no longer wore the uniform, but in his eyes still burned the fire of a man who never surrendered. Edward stood at the Atlantic City dock, not to watch the sea, but to confront injustice. In his hands, he held the battered blueprint of a ship, gripped tightly, like a soldier clutching his final battle flag. Iron Wave, the oak vessel he designed, built by hand and taught from for 45 years, was now impounded for a cold administrative reason, lacking a modern GPS system. But everyone in town knew Iron Wave was never just a vessel. It was a forge of engineering, a classroom where every bolt taught a principle, every plank whispered the wisdom of the waves. "Every nail is a lesson," Edward once said, his voice like a hammer striking steel. "Engineering isn't just mechanics, it's the art of saving lives." And so, when the news broke that he had been bound and his ship seized, all of New Jersey caught fire with outrage. No megaphone was needed. The word reached every street corner, echoed from high school classrooms to Ellen's bakery, from welding shops to Sunday pews. The harbor, once filled with the scent of salt and machine oil, had turned into a crucible, ready to strike at injustice. Online, the video, "They took Mr. Edward," ignited like a spark in dry grass. Tens of thousands of views surged in like a tidal wave. The comments rolled like battle drums. "Free Edward now! Iron Wave is a living legacy. We will not let a hero be forgotten." One former student, now an engineering professor at Princeton, wrote, "In 1992, Mr. Brooks taught me to design ships using wooden models. I learned wave dynamics. But more than that, I learned humility. Iron Wave didn't just teach engineering, it taught ideals." His words were picked up by national television, aired at prime time. Within hours, America stirred, not just for an old man's sake, but for a threatened value system. Who would carry that flame forward? The answer sparked from the Norfolk Naval Base. There, Thomas Reed, Chief Naval Engineer, 52, sat silently in his office, watching the video Marcus had filmed. 18 years old, capturing the moment Edward was led away. On Thomas's desk sat a file of handwritten schematics, created by Edward Brooks in the 1980s. Faded, but still legible, a life-saving system used by dozens of Navy ships. Thomas picked up the phone, his voice cold, unwavering. "Prepare the fleet. We're going to Atlantic City. That teacher must be honored." Back at the dock, Edward remained silent. He didn't know what was rising outside his town. Mrs. Ellen walked over, handed him a cup of coffee. The scent was strong, but he didn't drink. "You are the light," she whispered. Edward nodded quietly, then opened his old student log. Names emerged like embers in the forge. Thomas, James, Linda, Maria, each a memory, each a flame he had lit with his own 2 hands. The Coast Guard returned with a voice as cold as the cuffs they once used. "Your vessel violated navigational codes. No GPS." The mayor said nothing. No apology, no explanation. But on social media, a storm was rising. The Return Iron Wave movement launched. The hashtag #FreeIronWave spread across Facebook, X, YouTube, even TikTok. People from Boston, Seattle, even Texas began filming their support. They didn't know Edward, but they knew this: justice should never be towed away like an obsolete machine. Marcus, hands shaking with anger, went live from the dock. "Mr. Edward is our legacy. Who will stand for him?" Comments flooded in. "I'm a former sailor. Mr. Brooks fixed my ship in 1987. He didn't take a dime." Iron Wave forged an entire generation of engineers. No one has the right to erase that. In Norfolk, Thomas watched the live stream. His eyes lit with fire. He stepped onto the deck, gazed up at the Navy flag whipping in the wind, and said clearly to his captain, "Set course. This isn't just about a boat. It's about principle." Back in Atlantic City, Edward still knew nothing of the fleet sailing his way. But the wind had changed. The harbor began to tremble, not from waves or diesel, but from an invisible heartbeat. The heartbeat of a story being rewritten by those who once stood on iron wave with small dreams, now returning with full hearts. Edward asked for nothing. He made no plea. But in his eyes glimmered one truth. He was ready. Atlantic City was no longer still. It held its breath, like an army in formation, like a town on the verge, like a generation awaiting the whistle, not to depart, but to bring a symbol home. Dear viewers, take a sip of water, catch your breath, and stay tuned. The story is far from over. What happens next will surprise you. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? We love seeing who's with us from around the world. Type 1 in the comments if this story moved you, so we can keep bringing you more like it. Because stories like Edward's deserve to be heard and remembered. Atlantic City's harbor was no longer just a place of salt-soaked nets and quiet fishing boats slipping away at dawn. That morning, the entire town felt ablaze, not from sunlight, but from a fire long dormant, rekindled by legacy, loyalty, and long overdue justice. Edward Brooks stood tall at the edge of the pier, the crumpled blueprint clutched in his hand like a final shield guarding his honor. His eyes, thought to have grown weary after 81 long years, now burned like a welding flame, hot, sharp, and scorching through injustice. He did not bow. He did not retreat. He stared straight at the warehouse, where Iron Wave, the ship he'd built, taught from, and lived for over half his life, was being held like an outdated artifact. The dock was packed. From weathered fishermen to kids peddling bait carts, everyone stood breathless. This silence wasn't fear. It was reverence. They all knew. They were witnessing a moment that would be told for generations. Then, like a heartbeat breaking free, the thunder of naval engines echoed through the fog. 3 steel ships surged into the bay like arrows of justice, slicing waves that clapped against the seawall like thunderous applause. The American flag at the bow flew proud and defiant, a banner of reclaimed honor. A surveillance plane swept low overhead, its engines screaming across the clear sky, shaking the harbor, not just with thrust, but with the weight of memory. A fisherman's net slipped from his hands. Children tripped mid-run, still staring upward. Mrs. Ellen, who had served Edward coffee for 30 years, dropped her favorite mug. Its shatter rang like a bell tolling the end of silence. And amid this solemn chaos, Thomas Reed stepped off the lead vessel. His Navy engineer uniform crisp, metals gleaming in the sunlight. His hair, now touched with gray, could not hide the strength in his stride. The same stride he once took as a young student boarding Iron Wave for his first lesson under Edward Brooks. 3 officers followed behind, not like subordinates but like witnesses. The crowd parted instantly. Thomas said nothing. He walked straight to his mentor, seized his shoulders, and held him, as if trying to stop time itself. Then he turned to the crowd. His voice rang like a church bell. "Iron Wave is the forge of Edward Brooks, the man who designed rescue engines that saved hundreds of ships during World War II." No one spoke. But the silence had changed, no longer empty, but filled with honor. A ship's horn cried again, long and low, like an anthem for the sacred moment. Mrs. Ellen wiped away tears, whispering, "Dear God." Thomas continued, his eyes shining like the sea at sunrise. "He didn't violate anything. He is a legend. a living legacy. The crowd stirred. All eyes turned to Edward, still standing tall, like a mast that had never fallen, no matter how fierce the storm. A young Coast Guard officer stepped forward. He lowered his head. His hands trembled. "I'm sorry," he whispered. But Thomas didn't respond, not out of contempt, but because something far greater had arrived. From the stern of the lead ship, a woman stepped forward. Colonel Helen Carter, commander of the regional naval base, her white uniform immaculate, her medals shimmering, each one holding a story. But here, she was no longer a commander. She was a student. She approached Edward slowly, paused, and bowed her head. Her voice rose through the silent dock. "Sir, the United States Navy owes you a debt." And then she told the story of 1943, of a young sailor named Edward Brooks, who designed a rescue system not found in any manual, but which saved over 250 vessels in the freezing Atlantic waters. "Iron Wave is not just a boat," she said. "It is your legacy." The harbor was hushed, like a cathedral without a roof. Then she pulled out a bronze plaque and placed it gently into Edward's hands. "In honor of Edward Brooks, the flame of naval engineering." She stepped back and declared, "From this day forward, this harbor is a sanctuary of innovation." And then the applause broke. Not ordinary applause, but tears. Cheers. The pounding of feet and fists from a community that had just reclaimed justice. Edward took the plaque, his hands trembling, but his eyes wide open. They were filled not only with tears, but with light, the light of a fire that had never gone out. Thomas embraced him, like the boy he once was, learning to swing a hammer for the first time. Another Navy officer stepped forward, handing him a perfectly folded American flag. Edward received it solemnly, holding it like the values he had spent his entire life defending. And then, Iron Wave came home. The ship skimmed across the bay like a warrior restored. Its flag flapped boldly in the wind, its mooring lines lowered back into the place they once knew. The harbor shook one last time, not from machines but from hundreds of hearts, beating for what was right. Atlantic City lit up, not from the sun, but from the blaze of Iron Wave, now brighter than ever before. Edward Brooks once again stood on the deck of Iron Wave, a place that had once served as a classroom, a workshop, and, in his heart, a battleship. In his hand, the aged blueprint of his ship was clutched like treasure, its paper yellowed, but the ink as sharp as the day he first drew it. The wind swept through, tousling his silver hair beneath a worn cap, but his eyes remained unshaken, burning like a lighthouse, cutting through the fog of injustice, guiding a new generation forward. Iron Wave, once dismissed as outdated, once chained and labeled a violating vessel, now burned bright as a symbol reborn. No longer just a boat, it had become a flame that lit the foundation of American maritime engineering, living proof that true value can never be extinguished. Following Colonel Helen Carter's commanding declaration, the Navy did more than release Iron Wave. They funded the creation of a national maritime engineering museum right in Atlantic City. A wind of justice swept in, carrying pride back into the town. At the heart of the museum, Iron Wave herself. And as for Edward Brooks, he was its living soul, an old teacher who needed no podium, no spotlight, only a deck and a belief in the generation to come. On board, he continued teaching, just as he had for 40 years. with that same steady voice, deep and grounded like oak. Every plank is a lesson in engineering. Beside him stood Thomas Reed, his former student, now chief naval engineer, silent as a sentinel guarding memory. His eyes, once clouded with the pain of injustice, now shone with the light of a flame preserved. Not far away, Marcus, the 18-year-old student who once filmed the video that shook a nation, now served as assistant museum guide. He led visitors through the ship with a passion that lit up his voice, his eyes reflecting the very fire Edward had carried in his youth. In every tale Marcus told, people didn't just hear history. They witnessed the future being shaped. Atlantic City had changed too. No longer a sleepy port town. Fishermen began restoring their boats using traditional techniques. Mrs. Ellen, the woman who once dropped her coffee mug in awe, now led a foundation supporting traditional trades, funding woodworking and mechanical workshops for local youth. Children, once playfully running around the docks, now carved Edward Brooks's name into a wooden plaque placed at the pier, etching him forever into the town's memory as a hero without rank. The Brooks Maritime Museum opened without pomp, but with deep emotion. At its heart, displayed in gentle light, rested the 1943 ship blueprint, carried by Edward from wartime to waterfront. Each stroke of ink beneath the glass glowed softly, like a living legacy. Iron waves still bore the scars of time, splintered wood seams, hand-welded joints, worn mooring lines. But these imperfections were her truth. They proved that real craftsmanship doesn't lie in polished veneers, but in the knowledge and heart woven into every detail. Online, They Took Mr. Edward had now reached millions, but no longer as a cry of outrage. It had become a wave of inspiration. The comments came not only from Atlantic City, but from engineering students in Denver, teachers in Minnesota, mechanics in Texas. Edward Brooks is a guiding light. Iron Wave is a living legacy. We started a wood-based engineering class because of him. The hashtag #FreeIronWave had evolved. No longer a protest. It was now a symbol, a movement reminding the world that even in a digital age, there is still sacred space for precision, perseverance, and human touch. One young student from California posted, "Mr. Brooks didn't teach me coding. He taught me how to create, with my hands and with my heart." And Edward? He never sought recognition. He simply stood on the deck, watching his young students shaping their first planks, eyes steady, quiet, but full. In his gaze lived a silent, steady light, as if he saw his old crewmates, the ships he once saved, and the future rising from the hands of this new generation. Thomas approached and whispered, "You did it, sir." Edward didn't speak. He only nodded, tightening his grip on the blueprint, as if holding on to the hope of 1,000 future engineers. From a small harbor town, Atlantic City has become a beacon of engineering, a place where past and future converge, where Iron Wave no longer just tells old stories, but continues to ignite new dreams, fueled by the enduring flame of loyalty and timeless ingenuity. And so, from a boat once chained down by red tape, Iron Wave rose as a torch, lighting up the harbor of Atlantic City, rekindling faith in the lasting strength of what once was, and illuminating the quiet values lost in the rush of modern times. But this story doesn't belong to Edward Brooks alone. It's a reminder to all of us. Legacy does not protect itself. It needs keepers of the flame. It needs young hands and hearts willing to listen to the past to build what comes next. Somewhere in your own city, There may be an old teacher fixing broken engines, a quiet workshop still teaching the art of joinery, a forgotten boat resting in the back of a barn. The question is, will we pause to hear the story they're trying to tell? If your heart stirred hearing of an 81-year-old man standing tall for an old wooden boat, if you believe engineering isn't just numbers, but the soul of a generation, then share this story. Send it to a father who once showed you how to fix a bike, to an uncle who built your first chair, to a friend torn between career and calling. And if you, at any point in your life, ever dreamed of building something with your own two hands, then let that dream live on. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss stories like this, real, moving, and filled with purpose. Because someday, you may be the one to carry the flame forward. And if you're watching from the US, tell us in the comments, where are you tuning in from? And what is your iron wave? Because this story doesn't end in Atlantic City. It's only just begun.